In the previous video, I did talk about some of the peculiar habits of the ancient Egyptians as explained by Herodotus in his book Histories. In this video, I'm going to look at some of their religious practices. I welcome you to my YouTube channel where I explore ancient texts. The ancient texts I explore in this channel are those that have been around for thousands of years. Histories is one of those texts that have been around for a very long time. If you have not subscribed, subscribe so that you will not miss any of the videos that I publish. Now, Herodotus spends some time trying to explain to us the life in ancient Egypt. And this was like 2,500 years ago. Herodotus did go to Egypt. That's what he tells us in his book Histories. He went to Egypt, he had conversations with the priests at the temples at Thebes, and he did learn a lot about the history of Egypt and in fact the history of the ancient world in general. Now, in the previous video, I went through some of the things he noted that were peculiar to Egyptians, and most of these things they were doing were generally the opposite of what the rest of the world, the ancient world, the world as Herodotus knew it then, the things that the rest of that world did. Now, he also takes note, or he leaves us notes about the religious practices of the ancient Egyptians. Now, the ancient Egyptians, Herodotus tells us that they were very religious. In fact, this is what he says about them. They are of all men the most excessively attentive to worship of the gods. Yes, so they were very religious people. They put a lot of attention into the worship of the gods. And then he gives us some of the things, you can call them things or ceremonies or practices that they had to do as far as the worship of the gods were concerned or was concerned. Now, the first thing he mentioned is that they drink from cups of brass, which they score every day. Nor is this a custom of a few Egyptians. It turns out almost all, in fact he says all Egyptians did this. They always drank from cups of brass, and I guess brass is some kind of metal. And then they kind of like washed these cups strongly every day. And this is something that every Egyptian did, and it was part of their religious practice, or it's something they did because they believed that it was what was required of them by the gods. Now, the other thing he mentions that the Egyptian did because of their religiosity is that they practiced circumcision, and he says that to them circumcision was so important because they called it as part of being clean. And Herodotus writes that they circumcised and they thought that it was better to be clean than handsome. That's the line he uses. This is exactly what he writes. He says, they are circumcised for the sake of cleanliness, thinking it is better to be clean than handsome. So he puts this as part of religious practices, which of course makes us believe or leaves the impression that the circumcision was done because, or it was done as a religious requirement of the people. And then he tells us that they wore linen garments, and these linen garments had to be washed, and this cleaning had to be given a lot of attention. That's what Herodotus tells us. So it was so important that they wore linen garments, and these linen garments had to be thoroughly washed. The priests shaved their whole body every third day, that neither lice nor any other impurity may be found upon them when engaged in the services of the gods. So the priests had to shave every third day. So every third day they had to shave, and the way Herodotus puts it is like they had to shave the entire body, not just the head or the beard. They had to shave everything. That was required of them before they went and carried out any services to the gods. And he says that the priests wore linen only and shoes of piblas. and they were not permitted to wear any other garments and any other type of shoes, and these are the priests. And it tells us that they wash themselves in cold water twice every day and twice every night. That's a lot of body washing there. So they had to wash themselves twice during the day and twice during the night. Now, according to this translation, I couldn't figure out whether this is the priests going by the initial sentence or paragraph, or this applied to all Egyptians. Guess it's likely it is the priests who had to wash themselves 4 times in 24 hours. That means 2 times during the day and 2 times during the night. And that was important, especially when they were expected to engage in some religious ceremonies. Now, the priests were not expected to take care of themselves, the way Herodotus puts it, and this is common in most of the other societies, especially in ancient societies. The priests had to be taken care of by the rest of the citizens, and in fact he says that sacred food is cooked for them, and a great quantity of beef and geese is allowed each of them every day. And they also used to get wine made from grape is given to them. But they could not eat fish. It was not allowed for them to eat fish. So these other types of food were provided for them, but they were not allowed to eat fish. And he says they were not also allowed to eat beans, and this applied to all. The way he puts it, seems like all Egyptians didn't eat beans, and he tells us that they didn't grow beans in ancient Egypt, and they didn't eat beans. They didn't even test them. It seems like they saw beans somehow as something that was maybe unclean for some weird reason. They didn't like beans. And he says the priests indeed abhor the sight of the pearls, and they are accounting it impure. So the priest could not even look at beans. To them, beans were very impure. I don't understand why that was so, but they must have had their own reasons why they thought beans were impure. And then Herodotus tells us that the services of each god is performed not by one, but many priests, of whom one is the chief priest. And if any one of them dies, their son used to take up the role. So each god, remember Egyptians worshipped many gods, like very many ancient societies. They worshipped many gods, and Herodotus tells us that each of these gods was served by several priests, not one. One of them will be the high priest, and then there will be all these others. And if a priest died, then their son took over. So it seems like this was an hereditary office, basically. And then the Egyptians, it seems like, took the cow to be very sacred, and they held it in very high esteem. In fact, in some parts of the book is like the Egyptians never ate cow or cattle, but they could sacrifice it to the gods, something like that. I might be wrong, but there's somewhere he talks of it like that, and this is what he says. Now, the Egyptians used to treat cows as a very special kind of animal. Seems like they didn't really consume it, but they did use it for sacrifice. And Herodotus tells us that when they needed to do a sacrifice, or they needed to sacrifice a cow, then they needed to take it through some process. And he tells us that it was important that it was examined by, I think, a priest, and this priest will examine this animal very carefully. It needed to have all its body hair of the same color, and they will check the skin, they will check the tail, they will check everywhere to make sure that the color is the same throughout the body. And he also tells us that they will even check the tongue just to make sure it's in a certain way, and if they found something that they consider to be impure in the animal, then the animal will not be sacrificed. That's what Herodotus tells us. This is what he says. If the examiner finds one black hair upon it, he adjudges him to be unclean, and one of the priests appointed for this purpose makes this examination, both when the animal is standing up and lying down, and he draws out the tongue to see if it's pure, as to the prescribed marks, which I shall mention in another part of my history. Now, this animal had to be examined very carefully. While it's standing, while it's lying down, they check the mouth, the tongue, just to make sure it's pure before it could be sacrificed. This is what it is. Anyone who sacrifices one that is unmarked is punished with death. So after the examination, I forgot to mention this, the animal that is considered to be pure and could be sacrificed, a mark had to be put on its horn, and then that animal could be sacrificed. So seems like families or people will bring these animals to the priest to check them, to examine them, to basically give them an okay that it's okay, you can go and sacrifice this animal. And once that mark is put on the horn, then they can drive the animal away and just go and do whatever they need to do as part of the religious ceremonies. And it says that anybody who happened to go and sacrifice an animal that was not examined by the priest and approved by being given that mark, then will be punished with death. That's what will happen to such a person. Then Herodotus goes into the detail of explaining to us how the actual sacrificing is done. He tells us that the animal is taken to the altar, where a fire is lit, and then they pour some wine on the altar, and then they invoke the god before sacrificing the animal. And usually they will cut off the head, and then they use the rest of the body. And there was something about the animal head. Herodotus tells us that the Egyptian would not eat animal head, or any animal. So after they sacrifice the cow or the cattle, they would there were two ways to get rid of the head. One way was either give it to or sell it to the Greeks who lived around them, or if there were no Greeks to sell the head to, then they would just go and bury it on the ground, and then basically forget about it. So it looks like they used to give the Greeks this head. If the Greeks were not available, they didn't bury, they threw it into the river. So they will use the rest of the body, but they will not use the head, and the head would be given to the Greeks who would eat it. Herodotus tells us they will sell it to the Greeks, not really give it to them. So Herodotus also tells us that much of the process of sacrificing the animal was the same for all Egyptians, but turns out there were different, maybe you can call them sub-tribes, something of that sort in Egypt. And each of these groups did some things different from the rest. Like they didn't all do everything the same. The general process was the same, but there were specific aspects of that process that was done differently. It is what he writes. With respect then to the heads of beasts that are sacrificed, to the making libation of wine, all the Egyptians observe the same custom in all sacrifices alike. And from this custom, no Egyptian will taste of the head of any animal. But a different mode of disembowelment and burning the victims prevail in different sacrifices. So the general process is the same, but there are different ways of doing some detailed steps. And then Herodotus goes on to tell us the general process of removing the internal organs, except for the heart, I think, and the lung, and then putting in things like honey, raisin, figs, frankincense, myrrh, and other perfumes into the animal, and then now putting it on fire, and then putting a lot of oil on it while it's burning. That's how they did the sacrifice thing. And it tells us that they used to do the sacrifice while they fasted. They didn't do it after feeding or whatever. They will do it after maybe a few days or a few hours of fasting. Then they will do these sacrifices. when they and as the animal is getting cooked, basically they will beat themselves, um, and when they beat themselves, after beating themselves, they will put a bouquet of what remains of the victim. Now they will beat themselves as the animal is cooking, and then after that they will just feed on what is cooked. I did say that they didn't eat cattle, but it seemed that like they did eat during this process of sacrificing. Now here is a very important point to make about how the Egyptians went about with their sacrifices, as Herodotus describes it, and is that they didn't sacrifice female animals. They only sacrificed male animals, and in particular bulls. And Herodotus says that they did not sacrifice female animals or the cows because they thought that the cows were sacred to goddess or god Isis. Isis was made of the image of a woman with horns of a cow, and because of that, they could not sacrifice the cow. They would sacrifice the bulls. So that was out of respect to goddess Isis. That's what Herodotus tells us. Now, another thing that was kinda, or it was a religious, or was done or not done because of religious reasons, was that the Egyptian would not kiss a Greek. They would not kiss a Greek on the mouth, use a knife, spit or a cauldron of a Greek, or taste of any flesh of a pure ox that has been divided by a Greek knife. So if an animal was touched or killed by a Greek, the Egyptians will not eat it. Or even if their knife was used, let alone a Greek doing it, but if a knife of a Greek was used to kill the animal, then the Egyptians will not touch that, and they will not kiss the Greek and things like that, which is, I found that to be very interesting. Now, when an animal died outside of sacrificial or outside of sacrificing, the Herodotus tells us that the animal was disposed in different ways depending on whether it was female or male. And it tells us that to bury the kind that dies in the field, the females they throw into the river. When a female cow or a cow, yes, a cow dies, they throw it into the river. But when it's a bull, they will take it and bury it, and then they will have the horns protruding from the ground. And after the animal had the skeletons, or the animal has become skeletons, they will take those skeletons and go throw them some other part. That's what he described in that part of the book. He also points out that Egyptians, while they had the same general belief system, there were different groups, and I've mentioned this already, that had some sort of different belief that were kind of like not the same to everyone. Here is a paragraph I'll read. For the Egyptians do not all worship the same gods in the same manner, except Isis and Osiris, who they say is Banshus. But these deities they all worship in the same manner. So besides Isis and Osiris, the rest of the gods, there were different groups of Egyptians who would worship them in different ways, in their own way, not the same as everyone else. So he also mentioned that there were groups of Egyptians who would not sacrifice goats, and there were those who would sacrifice sheep. They would sacrifice sheep and not goats, and there were those who would sacrifice goats and not sheep. So when you read this book, especially that part where he explains to us in detail ancient Egypt, then you realize it was a complex society, like of course any other society. Okay, so if you found this to be interesting, please leave me a like and a comment. See you in the next video.